Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Speaking of Sundara, where I talk about my Sundara Dawn of a New Age RPG setting. As you can see, I'm back in my apartment. What you can't see is most of the mess behind me as I've just returned from Worldcon. But I figured since I sort of missed a week, it was time to get back to recording, and I figured what better way than to start off right back where we left off now that the Ask Me Anything is over. But I've been bouncing back and forth between cities and species, and it's time for one of my favorites and one I was proudest of for what I did with the setting, and that is the Orcs. Now, as we all know, orcs, of course, are not a unique fantasy creature. They've been around at least since Tolkien gave them to us, and there are arguments about how much further they stretch back than that when you get into language and myths and all of that. But for the most part, we all know what orcs are. We've all seen The Lord of the Rings. Most of us have read the books, and we've all been playing RPGs for years and years and years now. Orcs have been sort of the standard bad guy. They've been fill-in cannon fodder for low-level events. And over time, they've slowly metamorphosized into a player species. And I figured I would just capitalize on that, start exactly at the end where they've always been a player species, they've always been a part of the setting, and kind of give players a unique cultural perspective, I suppose, for a creature that has been a bad guy in so many different settings and for so long that just getting rid of that baggage entirely. But I might be putting the cart before the horse. So, what did I do with Orcs and Sundara that makes them unique and different? And starting off with, I decided to keep one of what I think is the important foundational stones that Tolkien put out in his work, and that I think kind of got left by the wayside over the years. There's the scene we all remember from the film, or you remember reading in the book, where we talk about the origin of orcs and how they were elves who had been taken by the Dark Lord and twisted and turned into something they were never meant to be. I wanted to take that and riff on it and do something a little bit different. So, one of the most accepted stories for orcs in Sundara is they were elves. That is sort of the origin story, or alternatively, they were made by elves. It's difficult to say which. But whichever one of those two happens to be true, whether it's elves that had changed and altered themselves so much they became a new species entirely, or whether they were sort of an experiment created as an offshoot by the elves, there is a very close relationship between those two species in the setting. Sometimes that relationship is friendly, sometimes it's familial almost, sometimes they hate each other. It's really going to depend on where you are and what the unique history of these two particular groups is. But if you could think of elves as kind of the flora of the setting, then orcs are the fauna of the animals to the plants for those who aren't familiar with the Latin. But orcs in Sundara have that adaptability that we see with the elves. It's not as pronounced. Unlike elves, orcs can't have children with basically any sentient species, but they can have children with a lot of them, which is where lots of the speculation came from as to whether or not orcs were at least trained in elven magic and elven sciences, even if they themselves had not been orcs once upon a time. There's also, orcs are one of the more long lived species in the setting, which is also kind of unusual as far as how orcs usually get treated. Generally speaking, orcs can live up to 300, 400 years or so, assuming nothing kills them. But given the kinds of very rough lives lots of orcs lead, that doesn't always happen. But orcs also, I wanted to make them more diverse than just these orcs wear different face paint, these orcs prefer a different sort of a skull on their flag. And so I wanted to sort of give everybody a choice of orc they could take that was unique and different, but that was still very clearly an orc, and it spoke to some of the archetypes and some of the unique things about those creatures across the genre and the way they've been implemented. So, like all of the others that you've heard me talk about thus far, all the other books I put out, you had 5 different types of orc that you could pick from. And each one was kind of inspired by asking, what if you took an orc but added a particular kind of, I suppose, a beast to it, some sort of natural evolution, or one of the unique advantages that predator species get. Mostly predator species anyway, but we'll get to that in a moment. But leading it off, we had the Minanka. Eventually, when I do the audio, you will see them in action for the short story I wrote for them recently. But the Minanka are best thought of as orcs if they were also wolves. They have a very pack-based society. They're very communal. They take care of one another. They have large pelts of fur almost. They have very strong, powerful jaws, that bite attack we're used to seeing from orcs. But they are also very, very quiet, and they tend to stay in the forest regions. And so they're often not a part of local societies, local towns. They'll show up from time to time, but they much prefer staying out in the wilderness, largely because their scent is such a powerful thing for them that living in amongst society, in amongst lots of all the different, whether it's garbage or smithing or mining, all of those industries can make it very difficult for them. So they tend to stay what humans think of as isolated. Speaking of isolation, past them we have the Nemlock, who, if they're sounding like something from the Time Machine, you're on the right track. The Nemlock are mostly a subterranean orc. They also have patches of hair, patches of very thick white fur. They have no melanin in their skin, and they have a kind of bat-like look to them almost. They're very gaunt, they're very long, and they have absurd hearing. Very few of them can fly, but they do tend to have thick claws that make for climbing in places that other people would never be able to climb. If you've seen The Descent, then you might have, and you've ever wanted to have that as a player, well, this is your chance. Beyond the Nemlock, we have the Faruna, who are what I meant when I said not all of them are based on predator species. Of the Faruna are colossal. They range from 8 to 12 feet tall, generally speaking, and you can find them on the plains. And the Faruna are sort of based off of bison and very large bovine creatures. They are huge. And being so big, they tend to just sort of be left alone. Anyone who wants to start a fight with one of them is already probably not in a great headspace, but someone who starts a war with an entire clan of them, or a herd as they're occasionally called, is just asking for trouble. And mostly the Faruna keep to themselves. They live out in the middle of nowhere. They eat a lot of grass-based food. There's not a lot of meat in their diet, if any at all, because it takes a lot of food to maintain peoples of this size. But, they tend to move along, find new lands, places that'll support them, and in so doing, they often find themselves forming relationships with smaller creatures who they might not want to live among them. Good examples are the halflings in the hills, which I will get to when I get to the halfling book. But you also find them around major cities that are kind of isolated. You'll find them out in towns of Sundara. They were one of the major factions in a city that was just in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by plains. They'd been coming there for centuries, and now that the city was re-inhabited, they were just excited to have neighbors again. But past the Faruna, we have the Barada, which is basically what happens when you take a shark and an orc and you put it together. They have the ability to exist both on land and in water. They have their own very unique and very difficult to speak language if you can't actually breathe underwater. And they sort of live in and around coastal areas for the most part. They often live in inhospitable places where other people don't want to be, particularly floodplains, things like that, because their nature allows them to just take these things in stride. But the Barada also have a tendency of living off in the deep ocean, and that's where things can get very, very strange very, very quickly, because they don't follow the rules and expectations that come with those who live on the surface, and their outlooks can be kind of alien to those who aren't used to dealing with them. And lastly, we have the Grundathi. And Grundathi are what happens when orcs and serpents sort of form a gene pool of. They're very slick, very strange, very flexible. They come from very hot regions, very jungle regions. And some of them, though not all of them, have managed to hold on to what is thought of as a very old adaptation of they actually have a venomous bite. And so it's not just those who can spit poison when it comes to a rap battle, but they're often not trusted by many people, because it's another one of the connotations that comes along with being a serpent. But their society has a very unusual and unique view on truth and fact. So it's one of those of From the Grandalthi's perspective, they told you exactly what you asked. From your perspective, they left out critical information that they should have volunteered but didn't. And so that's another one of the interesting things that comes along with that particular species. And these are just straight orcs. These are just the 5 options that I presented for the base book. But there's a whole other option we'll get to in the next video where I talk about the blooded, but that's fun for another time. But I am definitely not averse to doing more things with orcs, to expanding on them if this is a thing people sort of like and want to see more of. I am a particular fan of orcs because I feel they often got the short end of the stick when it comes to player options and player creativity, particularly with so many DMs who were stuck on the idea of orcs as bad guys and really didn't want to let their players just play around with them and have fun, especially if it meant not telling stories where you were an awful creature. And so, as usual, pleasure to see you all here. Glad you keep coming back. If there's a particular book that I haven't covered yet, if there was something I didn't mention in the AMA that you think should have a video dedicated to it, let me know. I make these videos based on what you guys want to see. So until then, I probably need to do some more resting now that I'm back from con. But I hope you all enjoy, and until I see you next time, happy gaming, everybody.